All right, welcome everybody to our 8th annual Science Summer Book Club. That's very exciting. We've been doing this for a bit. Our theme this year is the Summer of Soil. We're interested in reading and talking about soil science. And to start with, we'll do some introductions. So I'm Laura Williams. I'm an associate professor in the biology department at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island, which is a primarily undergraduate institution. And then let's see, right next to me, I've got Joel. So Joel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Joel Graff. I'm assistant biology professor at Montana Technological University. We changed our name a couple years ago. Anyway, I mostly study viruses, antiviral defense, but I've been interested in soil science for quite a long time. So I'm pretty excited that that was the topic this summer.
Yes, Joel had some great recommendations that made it into our list that people voted on. I really liked those. Then I've got Megan. Megan, do you want to introduce yourself?
I am a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison studying library science, specifically archiving. I'm doing my practicum at the Morton Arboretum right now, which is kind of really cool to get the botanical and the archiving together. So I went and worked on site yesterday and got to listen to this book on my way there and on the way back, and it just felt like kind of all connected.
Oh, that's very cool. And then next to Megan, we've got Nicole.
Hey everyone, it's Nicole Suktio, and I am currently a sessional instructor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, British Columbia, where most of what I've been teaching is lower division and upper division biologies of whatever vacancies may arise. So this has been kind of a nice book to come back to, nostalgia for when I was postdocing in a bit of forest soil microbial ecology, and grateful that nitrogen fixing bacteria at least get a shout out somewhere after chapter 5.
Yes, our first book is definitely not a microbiology themed book. And then last but not least, Joan, who is currently listed as iPad. I can probably change that if I need to.
Please. Thank you.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Joan Williams. I'm Laura's mother, and I am a retired person who lives in Fishers, Indiana, and just find it very interesting to get to read these books and share it with people who are interested in talking about it.
Excellent. All right, so our first book is this book called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. So this is by David R. Montgomery, who is, according to the back of the book, a professor of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington, or he was at least when this book was released. So this book came out in, I looked it up and now, there we go, 2007. So I think it's interesting because I think the order of our books this summer, this book is kind of a really broad with some history and some cross society analysis of the soil crisis. And it's from 2007. And I think our next book, The World Without Soil by Joe Handelsman, can be kind of considered an updated, take on what's going on with probably a bit more of a biological sciences focus. So this book really struck me as more kind of somebody's talking from, as his professorship would suggest, someone talking about this from an earth sciences standpoint, but who was trying not to, as a couple of folks have said, get too heavy into the soil chemistry, kind of geochemistry stuff. I think he was very purposefully trying to keep it more accessible, which I think he did.
I've read a couple other books by him.
Oh yeah.
And so if you want more of a microbiology look at this, he does cover that in his follow-up books. I think it was a 2015 book where he looked at both microbiology communities in the soil, and then did some comparing and contrasting with your microbiome, microbiota in guts, and how that affects the immune system and that sort of thing. Then he did another book called Growing a Revolution. Oh, that was the hidden half of Nature, and then he did Growing a Revolution. And I just looked it up on Amazon. Just double checking when those books came out, and I see he just has one. The audiobook was released 2 days ago.
Oh,
It's a book called What Your Food Ate, and it's subtitle How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. And it follows the nutrient cycles, or at least that's what it looks like, nutrient cycles and stuff of healthy food leading to healthier food, healthier soil leading to healthier food for us to eat.
yeah. Yeah. Joel, thanks for that. I think the hidden half is familiar to me, so I'm wondering if that made it onto our list of recommendations. But I think I saw you post about that, and that was one that I was interested in too. So
Yeah, this one, Dirt, is one that I hadn't read before, so I think that's maybe why it was tipped towards that being the one that we
yeah,
decided to read. But the others are definitely more microbiology focused. I kind of was feeling a little bad that a microbiology journal club was doing this book, but it drives home the point of erosion problems.
Comparatively, did you have any thoughts or insights like from reading his other stuff?
Well, I guess the one thing is that they were the one thing about his book, The Hidden Half of Nature, it kind of struck me because this guy was a geologist and then became interested in the soil. And then his wife is a scientist as well. And I think her name is Ann Bickle. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing Bickle correctly, Bikle. But anyway, if I remember right, she got cancer or something, and she wanted to eat healthier. And fortunately, she had been like, there was a brief moment where in this book where he talked about his wife putting all sorts of compostable material onto their lawn, and so he talked about that more in depth in that book, and then went into the biology, the soil microbiology. I came to this, I studied human viruses in grad school, and then about the time that I switched to my postdoc is late 2000s, is when the connections with how the microbiota in your gut connect to your immune system. And so there were several people that joined the lab that I was working in that were interested in that. And so, and then when I moved to Montana Tech, I had been thinking so small for so long. And then I was asked to teach an introduction to evolution course. And it made me like zoom way out and think like huge time scales and whole earth and all this stuff. And that's when it got to the biodiversity, all of a sudden it got back to basically in human guts, the better your biodiversity, the more healthy you are. And then then when I started reading about soil health, same thing, the better the biodiversity, the better the soil health. And so that's about the only thing I guess I can really comment on, is that this guy came at it from a completely different direction, but we ended up in the same spot, being interested in the microbes.
Yeah, and I would say I absolutely don't regret reading this, even though it's doesn't have an extensive microbiology focus. I mean, it was either last summer or the summer before, we did a whole summer of physics. So we just dispensed with microbiology entirely. So we might try to make sure it's represented, but I certainly don't mind reading things about that. And I felt like this one was a good one to start the summer's theme, because it really lays out the soil crisis that we're experiencing, and that this is a historical crisis. It's not something brand new, in the last couple of decades.
I think he does a really good job of laying that out, but I also kind of found it too long, like really got boring for me and like repetitive. I'm like, I get it. I don't necessarily need every single example.
I think it was somewhat exhaustive. Probably there are people who would argue it was not exhaustive, but it felt as a reader that it was a somewhat exhaustive compendium of like, I will give you the fire hose of examples so that I can keep kind of returning to these points. I was just actually curious as a way of kind of starting out thinking about this is, I was curious for everybody here, when you first became aware of the soil crisis and like in what context, because to give my own perspective on this, I grew up in Indiana, which has, you know, a lot of agricultural influence. You know, my town has developed a lot, but when I went to high school, it was in the middle of cornfields. But if they were talking about the soil crisis, I didn't absorb it at that time. And I don't really think I became fully aware of it. I'm going to be honest and say that I don't really think I became fully aware of it until I got here to Providence College. And one of my colleagues who teaches Gen Bio has the lab students do something called the Doom essay, where he kind of gives them a list of like, here are some kind of looming ecological catastrophes. So you go write a short paper on it and talk about why it's a potential crisis and like what we could be doing about it. And he had soil crisis on there. And I have to admit, I was like, I'm not really sure what you mean. So this was maybe my first or second year as an assistant professor in the biological sciences that I really kind of understood exactly what it was. Megan, you got your hand up. What did you know about that before?
So I mentioned this on Twitter, but my first exposure to it was the Soil Will Save Us book. And so my interest, my background, as most of you probably remember, is like in food.
Mhm.
And so I was coming at it from this farming, food background, kind of this idea of like holistic farming. I had read pharmacology somewhere around then, which seems like it's kind of similar to Montgomery's other book, The Hidden Half of Nature. And I think I was just like completely floored with, you know, that one really focuses on like carbon sequestration, but also it was one of the first times that I really, really thought about like plant biodiversity and how meaningful that could be, both like in a broader sense of like it's good for the earth, but also just, you know, in a smaller sense of like how it affects our diets and how limited our diets truly are because of the plants we choose to grow.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a really interesting thinking about it from a food perspective, you know, in terms of not only just nutrition, but just like what's available to us in terms of what we use to make our food, you know, could be significant from a cultural standpoint too. And yeah, that's really interesting. Nicole, what was your first like awareness of the soil crisis?
I think probably just the precarity of the 1 inch that we've usually got to work with, which was a highlighted talking point during World Soils Day, which happened sometime in 2015. And I think I was at the joint meeting of the Canadian Soil Science Society, and it's abbreviated ISMOM, which was the International Society of Organic Matter and Minerals or something like that. So, but there was also like the Quebec Soil Society. So a lot of sort of soil conservation narratives are being interwoven at this conference. But I think it's kind of interesting to also think about my time in sort of ag tech, where like, you know, no one talks about the soil crisis. We talk about return on investment with the products that we use. So of course, you know, we're still marketing technologies to monocropping systems. A lot of the themes in the book about, you know, endorsing modifications of soil, I mean, in the vein of sustainability, so using your marl and using your manure, but like an amendment plan is really like the way you approach cultivation in sort of industrial level farming. So it's kind of viewed from the systematic manipulations are all the things that farmers as consumers are putting in first, and not much of that preoccupation on what the land is doing or the intactness of regulatory systems within, So we don't talk about the soil crisis enough. And I mean, like that whole chapter about Darwin watching worms and like that whole process, I think that actually more than anything really kind of drove home, like just sit and watch. And that's not quick stuff, but like the amount of resource intensive behaviors of many types of fauna, along with the mineral process, is really kind of, I think, is the sideways entrance to understand why we have a soil crisis when you actually think about what needs to happen to have that resource.
Yeah, that's yes, it's a lot more complicated than just having dirt.
When I was doing my undergraduate degree, I was living in Utah and I was working with a CSA there, like volunteering for them and just learning about what they do. They use a lot of permaculture and organic style farming, though they weren't like certified organic or anything. And then I was also taking a agriculture in society class, like through the agriculture department. And that kind of dichotomy of the like inputs as formula versus like, I don't know, looking at the ground and seeing what it needs, like memorizing, this is how you determine how much nitrogen you need or how much of this to buy. And I was like horrified by it.
Yeah.
I mean, soil assessments and soil, whatever is being defined or curated into the definitions of soil health or nutrient testing does still get used and does still get packaged as something that is a commodity within conventional agriculture. But I mean, a lot of it, there's a very utilitarian and very narrow framing for it. It's going to be crop specific. It's going to be your rotation regime specific kind of thing. Again, it's not about giving that piece of geography back its regulatory regime. It's more like, can we keep things going on where we've chosen to be?
It's not an ecosystem-based approach.
Yeah.
I mean, he talks about this quite a bit in the book, even where they're like, they knew better, but they didn't care.
Yeah.
They cared about money more, they cared about commodity more, or they didn't have a choice or whatever it was. So it's like, it was really interesting to kind of have him establish that historical pattern of like capitalism or consumerism over what's best, best practice.
So Mom, Joan, Mom, as somebody who's lived in the Midwest for some time now, what did you, where was your awareness of the soil crisis?
No, I would say not, but I would say I had a vague awareness from reading The Grapes of Wrath and seeing that when that was the Dust Bowl, that was kind of like, oh, all that dirt, but it didn't really sink in how impactful it would be across the country. So no, I really didn't. I mean, that was in the back of my mind. And when you guys started talking, I checked to make sure that was the right book. But I remember reading that. And then I remember seeing the movie with Henry Fonda and all the dirt, everything just blowing away. So in the back of my mind, that was there. But no, not really. And then I was going to say, too, that I agree with Megan that we kept going over things, but I thought it was very interesting when he talked about Iraq was Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, and that is all sand now. I mean, the dirt, from what he's saying, is gone. I don't know whether there's any arable, any plantable soil there, but I thought that was very interesting too.
It's that struck me as well, because one of the ways he talked about it is the sense of, you get these, if you ever read kind of history, like I've finished a couple books recently that are just by coincidence happened to talk about different historical things around the year 1000, so a little over 1,000 years ago. And it's interesting to see when people have these oral traditions and these oral histories and these legends that get passed down where they're talking like the forested lands of Iceland, and then you get people who are going, well, Iceland isn't forested now, so maybe that was an allegory for a thing. And you're like, no, 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 this is just massive, wide scale change of your landscape that has happened due to colonization and cultivation and so forth. I thought that struck me too. That struck me that the time scales of erosion that we're talking about, the erosion is happening so fast that it can, over centuries, dramatically change the type of landscape that you're talking about. And so people's oral traditions or just legends that have been recorded can seem very different because the massive changes that have happened over small periods of time. Just the bits where they were saying, where he said in there, he had so many examples of like, this town was a port town. And then it's like miles away from the coast now, just because of all the sediment that got dumped. That's pretty extraordinary too.
I think it's easy to like dismiss. What I like about this is the scope of it, and I didn't finish it, so I don't know where the scope ends. But I think it's easy also to dismiss that sometimes and be like, that was a long time ago, we've learned from then. But then to think like how close the Dust Bowl was and how I feel like we very clearly have not learned from that.
Yeah. Joel, being out in Montana, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I guess when I first got interested in the soil stuff was I mentioned it was about the time I was teaching evolution, but the book that got it for me was I read we read a Michael Pollan book a couple of years ago, didn't we? So I probably mentioned this before, but The Omnivore's Dilemma was a book that I had always heard good reviews about or whatever. It was always on my reading list. So for like 10 years, it was on my reading list. And then I finally got around to actually looking at it. And that one got too long too. But the premise of that book is discussion is broken into 4 parts. And the 4 parts, each part of that book is about a meal and the food system that is used to create the food for that meal. So the very first one, so the first 2 meals are interesting, and I don't even really remember what the second 2 meals were. The very first one was eating McDonald's drive-through and just going for a Sunday cruise. So they were wasting gas as they're going around eating their McDonald's food. And that one really hit me, where they're talking about how much oil is required and energy is required to make the fertilizer, and that like 10 calories worth of energy from oil is used to produce 1 calorie of food for us to eat. And that's just not a sustainable thing, obviously. And then the second, so it was basically just giving a understanding of conventional agriculture. And the second meal that he goes through is kind of the organic, regenerative soil-based food. Michael Pollan visits a farmer in that part of the book whose name's Joel Salatin. And I've read several of Joel Salatin's books too. And but anyway, he's kind of got a very interesting personality, but he was raising cattle, but he was thinking about raising soil before he even talked about raising cattle. And Laura, you were born where there's surrounded by corn. I was surrounded by cattle. I think there's something like 60 to 80,000 head of cattle in the county I grew up in, and there's far less than 2,000 people. So the cattle to person ratio is quite high. And my dad was a cattle rancher. Yeah. And so when I grew up, every summer I worked on the ranch, and we worked hard. We worked, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And one thing that was kind of fun about ranching is that you got calving season, then we had lambing season, then we had fixed fence season, then we had first cutting, and then we had spray weeds, then we had second cutting, and then we had fall stuff. And so the season always was changing, and so that was always interesting. But it's just like we went through every summer. We just kind of went through the same process, and it was almost, by the time I was a senior and heading off to college, I was just used to that. That's just the things you did. And so I was in this whole mindset of, that's how you farm, that's how you ranch. And one of my biggest accomplishments I felt when I was in high school was there was an area on our ranch where my dad decided to plow it up and turn it into some dry land wheat fields. And so I drove this tractor for probably 3 weeks straight. So yeah, 20 plus days. I made close to 100 new acres of wheat field. And I was like, it just seemed so big. And I knew that I was the one that drove the tractor that did this and everything. And we subsoiled twice. Then I went through a disc plow twice. And you know, I was really proud that I had done this. And I was, and every time we would drive by, me and my wife, I'd be like, hey, there's that field I made. You know, I was just so proud of it. And it's now turned back into prairie. They stopped, I'm guessing there weren't many nutrients to begin with, and it just wasn't a very good place to put a wheat field. But I think back to how many hundreds of gallons of diesel and effort and erosion I caused and everything. And so while reading The Omnivore's Dilemma, it just like, my biggest accomplishment, one of my most things I was most proud of, turned into this, oh my gosh, what did I do, sort of a feeling. So that really struck me when I was reading that.
I feel like
kind of reminds me of the part in Dirt where like he said that like if you were hand farming, you could get more food off of less land than if you had ox. So you needed twice as much land to produce the same amount of food if you were using ox power, which I mean, it's a different context, but just that idea of like using so much energy to create less food, less consumable it's like, that's the commodity is the consumption of all the things. That's what we care about more than like eating food or having food.
Yeah, it's, boy, there's so many different directions you could go off from this. But I was really interested by, it's towards the end of the book. So if folks didn't make it all the way to the end, you might not have encountered this yet, but he talks about, I think it's a researcher who started asking why people till, like why people start certain plantings with tilling. And when he was in his I think his college years, he would ask all of his professors, like, why are we tilling? And they would go, well, you know, because of this and this, you break up the ground, you do this thing. And then he would push them, and they'd finally go, look, I don't know. It's just the first step. It's the first step, and then you do the rest of it. And so that's kind of one of the ways that this person came to kind of starting to try to test out no-till, is because he couldn't get an adequate explanation for why they were doing it. And that just struck me that there's so many agricultural practices that are kind of handed down as like, these are the ways you do this. And to Joel's story, it's like that wheat field, you're gonna grow wheat. Why would you not want to grow wheat? Like, people need wheat, we need grain. Why would you not do it? You know? So I think it's interesting to think about kind of the traditions that kind of get passed into farming. And some of it is the perception of farming, how different people kind of create that I don't want to say class necessary, but that group of people who, I mean, you can have people in Washington, D.C. who'll talk about farmers, and it's just, it takes on this almost evocative, iconic, like the American farmer. And then they do this, and they give you your, you know, let's show like fields of wheat. That's how we indicate that we're a wholesome, productive country. It's because we're growing wheat, you know? I think that's really interesting. how those traditions kind of get their own life outside of just the actual, like, what can your system produce, and what are you trying to grow?
The idea of the farmer is really this politicized figure. It's really interesting. It's definitely an archetype. And when you hear the word farmer and you think of farmer, you think of like someone with their hand in the ground. But a lot of times the word farmer, what that means is the landowner, and they're not necessarily the ones working the land or making choices about the land or anything. And so we have all these layers between what actual farmer is and what our brain thinks a farmer is.
Yeah, I mean, Mom, there's members of our family that are still doing the raise hogs,
Yes.
right?
Raise hogs on a small family farm. Yes, south of Indianapolis. Yes.
Did they used to do crops too? I can't remember. I feel like they did.
They may have. They did milking cows before when they were in Franklin, and milking cows is such a restrictive schedule because you have to milk in the morning and the evening. So then they went to the pigs and the hogs when they moved to Greensburg. So,
Yeah.
but I don't know whether they're growing any crops or not right now, but it is now owned by the 5 brothers and sisters since the parents passed away. So it's still a small family farm.
And we had, I mean, when I was in high school, I had, because I said I, went to high school in cornfields, but I had a friend whose family, I don't know, Jessica, Mom, I don't know how much her parents were doing farming when she was in high school, because they were older at that point, but they had a whole big, huge pieces of land that I think they might have kind of leased out to possibly companies. But now we've had so much development that you drive past it and their house is still there, but I think they're like surrounded by
They're surrounded by development.
Yeah.
They've got big trees around their property. They kept about 5 acres, but
yeah, but they
they
used to
sold it for development.
it used to be all corn. So
Yep.
that's been a really striking part of growing up where I did and kind of going back to see things, is because I think a lot of that land that used to be all kind of agriculture is just, it's housing developments now, which is something they talk about he talks about in the book.
Well, in the book, they also talk about Silicon Valley because they had that era, that time where they talk about how good the soil is there. And then they developed all of that Silicon Valley in California. And then another thing I remember reading here in Indiana is they put a big Honda plant down in Greensburg. And so I can't remember, they needed an enormous amount of land to put the Honda plant in the parking lot for all the employees. And they said that the people that had the best land and had been successful were the people that sold. And the people that had the less productive land were the people who didn't want to sell. That's what the newspaper article, and I thought, well, that's very interesting that the people that have been scrapping along were the ones that didn't want to give it up, and the people with the very good soil were willing to sell to this Honda plant. Yeah.
That is interesting. Huh. What's the situation right now with the cattle ranching, Joel? Is land getting taken over by different things?
Well, our population is actually going down in my county. It's a lot of, the people moving out of rural areas to cities is a continued thing. The cattle ranchers don't have it that great right now. Although some of them drive around these gigantic pickups, and I think, well, you must be doing okay because that thing cost $100,000. But anyway, the price of meat keeps going up, but they sell cattle for roughly the same amount, and so the packers are getting profits. So there's a lot of middlemen that are making a profit, and so there's kind of what's interesting.
Are the packers in the same area, or does the cattle have to be transported?
The cattle have to be transported. A lot of where I grew up, all I ever saw was happy cows out in the pasture, so I thought it was all good. And then after reading The Omnivore's Dilemma, I realized our cattle are all being raised up till, such and such an age, and then they go to a feedlot for finishing. And so the feedlot takes a cut, and then they sell it, then it goes to the packers. Anyway, I don't remember where I was going with all that, but
I'd asked you about land. What was happening to the ranching land?
Oh yeah, the land. The land has always been marginal in Southeast Montana anyway.
Mhm.
In the Dust Bowl era, a lot of the cattle ranchers went under, and the person that, my dad didn't actually own the land, we leased the land, but the person that we leased from, his dad during the Dust Bowl raised sheep. So all these cattle ranchers were going out of business, but the sheep actually did fairly well through that. And sheep are better about digging through snow and getting grass and stuff like that. But anyway, so this guy really grew his ranch. So this ranch I'm talking about that I worked on, it was 20,000 acres at the main part, and a lot of, and with several hundred acres of alfalfa. So all summer long I was cutting alfalfa. We're making hay for the winter.
Yeah.
And then in the summer, all of our cattle and sheep would be shipped over to the second part of our ranch, which was another 20,000 acres. So we had 40,000 acres we were dealing with. The area with the summer pasture that we had, because it was far, it was 60 miles away, and 30 of it was dirt roads, so it was hard to get to. That 20,000 acres was just 3 separate pastures, and the livestock would be put into one pasture for an entire summer, and then they would be put into a different one, and so we'd rotate it through those 3 pastures over the course of 3 years. So there was a little bit of land management, but anyway, I don't know, I'm kind of getting off topic, but there's a lot of people now moving into my area that are they got rich somewhere else, and now they have a ranch as a toy, basically. So there's that's why the population is going down, is several small ranches will sell, and then someone comes in with money and buys gigantic chunk of land and has it as a toy.
I feel like that goes back to Megan's point about, which is a theme of the book, the idea that soil and land stewardship, soil stewardship and just stewardship of the land is much less likely for someone who's not present and not really tied to that. They own it. They're extracting from it. They're extracting wealth from it, but they're not really involved with the day-to-day management of it. They don't see it. They don't kind of understand really what's going on, which you can see being a major problem. You're less likely to kind of invest in the long-term health of something that you just acquired as either a toy or a commodity that you're, if you treat them like stocks, you're like, I'm gonna hold this commodity as long as it's beneficial. Then once it's not, I'm gonna dump it and do something else.
I think there's other factors that are coming in too, and like Joel maybe touched upon it a little bit, but like just north of where I lived in Utah, there was a pig farm. They just announced that they're closing the pig farm because gas prices to take the pigs to California to have them be slaughtered is just way out of control. And then the farm and the slaughtering conditions make them ineligible to be, the meat ineligible to be sold in California at all. So they need to then ship it back out. And so they're like, we're just going to shut down. Not that pig farms are the, peak of soil science, but it's indicative of what's going to be happening across different ranching and farming industries. That got those gas prices are kind of scary.
Yeah. I see Luke popped in. How's it going, Luke?
Good. Sorry I'm so late.
That's okay. We were really kind of more talking after reading this exhaustive account of soil erosion. We really have been mostly talking about our own kind of personal encounters with land and soil and how we've been kind of how that intersects with what he's saying. I did think it was interesting that there's solutions offered to the soil crisis here, but they're not really. And Joel mentioned that he's written many more books, so maybe other books kind of get into more of the like, let's really dig into it. But this book seems like it was very clear that he was just, let me lay out to you that there is a soil erosion crisis, that it has been happening for some time, that civilizations usually run into this issue, and that limits their lifespan. But he kind of pointed to solutions, but they didn't really go into a real, what I would consider litmus test, a rigorous kind of analysis of, is this a practicable solution? Would this work? Under what context? What would we need? That kind of thing.
I haven't read as much as Joel with this, but like I found that to be the case in the things that I've personally read, that there's a lot of like, this is the solution and the issue is buy-in. Like, how do we get people to buy into it? How do we get people to agree to pay more for their food or pay more for their other commodities and resources? Because that's what it takes to treat the land with respect, to treat the animals with respect, to, you know, bring small farming back. It you know, costs money that people aren't willing to spend.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that we always kind of hope for a number of our crises, we're always kind of hopeful that science will kind of, I think he even mentions like pulling rabbits out of the hat, just that science is going to go, ta-da, we fixed it. And the newest thing that he doesn't get as much into, because this was originally published in 2007, is more kind of genetic engineering of crops. Nicole, remind us what your colleagues and kind of, you were talking to some people who were doing some agri stuff, right? Was that was in the realm of kind of trying to,
you mean the one time I managed to work outside of academia? Is this what we're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I mean, we were making a product that, you know, kind of could be poised as something that was an alternative to conventional agriculture, in the sense that it wasn't a true fertilizer. It was a microbial ferment that was supposed to be supporting plant growth and health through a number of proposed mechanisms. But the channel that we were selling through with the structure of the company was still targeting conventional buyers. So this was stuff that was going into a tank mix that was still going to have an NPK program and all the other stuff that, you know, are considered primary growing things. And of course, by the time you're also addressing this, and to sort of tag on to the idea of GMO, is that many of the trialing runs that were being done with the fertilizer company that eventually got incorporated into the business that I was employed at, they were using sort of cultivars of canola that were provenances from a company like BASF that had already been optimized for yield. So, you know, with the conventional lens and the conventional approach, they are already kind of working with industrially vetted phenotypes on top of like this management manipulation of nutrient content. So you're almost kind of like customizing to these short growth cycles. So it kind of becomes interesting to figure out where microbial products fit here, in part because we were also working with a product concept that aren't the typical microbial amendments that get used. Without getting into too much detail that would violate NDA, but like the textbook example would be, you know, selling an inoculant, you know, nitrogen fixing bacteria, shout out whatever happens after chapter 5, something that can interact directly with a root system of a plant to supply bioavailable nitrogen that otherwise is in abundance in the atmosphere, but is not converted to the correct form. So, you know, those are products where, number one, when you think about the farmer's perception, it's easy not just to sell the idea, but there's this already well integrated mental model based on the biological interaction that very directly shows a relationship between a nutritional benefit and the product. And I think this is something that also tacks onto what Megan was saying about the buy-in for a no-till system or regenerative, based on timescales that David Montgomery's already very well laid out in the book, that ideally we're talking about these hundred to 1,000-year processes for good soil accumulation, which means aggregates that are coupling together microbes that would be participating in step-by-step parts of nutrient cycling, that would be, you know, providing appropriate environments for root systems. Those aren't a one-season growing outcome. Like, you're not really going to be making a pamphlet to talk about, in 20 to 40 years. Yeah. So I don't think this really answers your question to some extent, but yeah, we were working with a microbial product, but still trying to deal with framing and selling in the context of conventional agriculture. So I mean, I do have somewhat of an insight on the difficulties of trying to even get buy-in for something that's not even being couched as being that radical or divergent from the common practices.
Right. So then the question comes from that is, if you need to adopt significantly different soil stewardship practices, how on earth do you get people to do this? And how do you
legislation?
Even,
so
it does
this
have
is
to
my
be,
dream,
right?
My dream is that, you know, the agriculture people get subsidies anyway, but instead of subsidizing grain or whatever, what if you're subsidizing crop cover? What if you're subsidizing nitrogen fixing? What if you're subsidizing other things that are about like improving the soil health and not like yields?
I think you'd have to do it. I mean, he talks about that a little bit about how much, and it's a point that gets raised in the news sometimes, kind of farm subsidies gets brought up. But he makes the point exactly like you said, Megan, that right now all that subsidy support, which is a policy, not even policy, it is a practice shaping tool. And right now it just goes to kind of conventional farming, which is really just about extracting.
It's really antithetical insurance, which is like, if you make too much, we'll reward you anyway. And then the subsidies go in, the grain or whatever it is isn't used, and it's not like sustainable. It's not moving forward in any kind of sustainable direction.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that worries me is, like, he's saying that in 2007. It's much later than that now, so it comes back to that buy-in issue.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that I thought, you know, he had a very specific focus with this book, which was kind of a historical, I'm going to hit you with, like, this is a crisis. As we've said now a few times, it's been a worldwide crisis. Different regions have experienced it. Egypt is like the only one that escaped it until recently. And it's been happening, you know, every civilization that starts to grow past a certain point has experienced this issue. So he really lays that out. But where I started to kind of twitch a little bit is as he was getting into discussions of, well, here's what we're going to do. We could really have people kind of farm small farms and kind of focus more on this system that allows them to do subsistence farming. And I kind of thought, you're going to run into an ethical issue whereby you're going to go into certain places and have developmental, like NGOs, developmental organizations, kind of go in and try to tell people, you should just remain farmers, but you should do it small and you should do it responsibly, and then that will be great. And I think that's tricky, because if you're tying people to the land, then you're kind of reducing their opportunities. So I think that's difficult, because that's prompts a lot of people to, you know, go into market economies and things, is because they're trying to kind of advance, they're trying to accumulate wealth, but they're also looking across at the opportunities that they want. And sometimes that might not be, I want to stick around on this farm and continue to kind of be a soil steward. So I don't think it's bad. I just think it made me twitch a little bit because
No,
you could
there's-
end up with a system that locks people into something and kind of cuts off and constrains their other opportunities.
There's people who are interested in this. There's people who are hobby farming or hobby gardening and want to convert. So I've really been thinking about over the past 5 to 7 years, like, how do you make that more viable, more sustainable? I'm just going to keep saying it comes back to that buy-in, but like,
Yeah.
how do you get people into being a locavore or thinking about seasonality or thinking about regionality in their food and the what they consume? And it's like, I think that if everyone goes to like a small farm model, it's not the solution because it's not scalable.
Mhm.
But like, pick and choose those things that you're gonna spend the money on. And maybe it doesn't make a difference, but at least you're doing something towards making a difference if enough people do it. I mean, I think we do see some changes happening in some states. I just don't know if it's enough.
Well, I think there's definitely good case studies for consumer power because there's major meat producers that moved away from antibiotics strictly through consumer pressure, because that's certainly something that our regulatory agencies have been lagging on for quite some time. And so I think the big push to get antibiotics out of U.S. meat production, it was driven by consumers saying, I don't want to buy this if it's going to be raised with antibiotics. That can potentially backfire on you because you can have misinformation about certain things. Like we talked about when we did, summer of food. We talked about kind of the perception of genetically engineered or genetically modified foods. So consumer power can go that way too. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
I mean, what Polyface Farms, Joel Salatin's farm and his family has been able to do is really popularize like the multi-use of what you need to do with a farming space. Like, if you're not using the land 3 ways, you're not doing it right.
Is this where it was like, I think Joel was talking about this. It was, I started with this and then I realized in order to have this, I needed like chickens roaming around. But then with the chickens,
so he
I
had
needed to
grazing
have
land and
this.
then he had the chicken lawnmowers. And then like, I got to meet his son. He came to a conference in Utah and they're growing mushrooms on logs in a space like that they're not using otherwise, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And just always looking for that way to like produce more food or add something new to the soil or whatever it ends up being.
Yeah. Luke, you got any thoughts you wanted to, not to put you on the spot, I'll just see if you had any thoughts you wanted to share about the book, however far you got through it.
Yeah, I was listening to it and I had about an hour left, so I didn't finish it. I will, but I didn't finish it before this meeting. It's when you said that most of the discussion has been around your own personal relationships with soil and farming and things like that, that made sense to me because that's what I found to be the most informative part of this book, or at least the part of the book that was kind of new information to me, the relationship between soil care and soil management and people and societies. Like the actual science part of it, even though I'm by no means a soil scientist, I more or less kind of knew, like it wasn't any new information to me, but the like what you were referencing and the kind of the main thesis of the book, how societies kind of rise and fall based on their soil management. That I thought that was kind of an interesting concept, one that I hadn't really considered. And so that was what I found the most interesting part of this book. But I did, just from like a bit of a structural perspective, I found it a little repetitive. I was like, okay, I get it. And so I'm at the part where what you were kind of saying, where he's talking about the new, or like potential solutions so that we can maybe get out of this cycle. And I'm starting to find that interesting again, because it's kind of a break in the format.
Yeah, it was really like dissertation level intense detail about all the different
Yeah, totally.
examples of soil erosion, for sure. Okay, so we're
I
coming
put a
up-
link to, sorry, I put a link to Growing a Revolution. That's another
Ah.
book that he wrote, and that does get more into the regenerative agriculture side of things. And so if you want to get past the collapse of societies over and over, that might be where you might look next if you do want to try this author again.
I do
saw-
go ahead, Luke. Yeah.
Sorry, I had seen that book, and I might check it out because it does sound cool.
I do think it's I think I really enjoyed reading this because I don't know that Mom mentioned the Grapes of Wrath and the Dust Bowl. And I think that was also kind of my, maybe in the back of my mind, sort of awareness of the soil crisis. So I am glad I read this, because you come away with it saying, okay, yes, this is a long-standing, this is an issue that we've got to deal with once you reach a certain size of your society and you're trying to feed them on different land. And I think I'm glad I read this for that reason, even though, yes, it was exhaustive. I was just gonna hold up to my, very awkwardly hold up to my camera. I do also like that there were some pictures for folks that did the audiobook like this, that actually were illustrations, like examples that people who are interested in this have found of dramatic soil erosion. So that's Iceland. And so it's I'm not going to say this right, but there's an Icelandic word, kind of rofabard, for a kind of a hillock of soil that managed somehow to stay together where everything else eroded away around it. And I just think there were some illustrations in this of gullies and so forth that I thought,
I'm just
wow.
mad that we had to get past 3 illustrations of plows to get to the pictures of gullies. Like, I just wanted to see some of that. Like, there was one of those ancient cities that he had at the end, where you can see the half-built the door sills, and like, I'm just like, show us more of this, so we can kind of understand, like,
very striking,
the end product of land, like sediments, not
even without the illustrations. From the audiobook point of view, he had like a lot of kind of factoids that really stuck out to me, that I thought that those were really strong, when he was like, I can't say a real one, when he's like, the length of the height of that rose, 3,000 gallons a year. Oh, I don't know what I'm talking about, but it really drove it home for me. But the first time and the second time and third time and the 10th time, and then when we started getting into like the double digits, I'm like, I'm with you. I'm
sold on the site. I'm sold on the crisis. There is a crisis. Did anybody get to the stuff about the guano deposits? That was there was a section, if you get to it, there's a section called, in the chapter Dirty Business, where he talks about the US getting into the guano business and taking over like little islands so that they could just extract and ship their guano away. Like, there was legislation, there was I'm not going to be able to find it, but there was
the guano tax, right?
Yes, there's like, there it is. First of all, President Franklin Pierce, who I always forget was actually a real person and a president, 1856 Guano Island Act, making it legal for any US citizens to claim any unoccupied guano island as their personal property. What?
That was cool. I finished that part this morning. I thought that was pretty neat.
Yeah, so I mean, there things like that where you kind of bring in how it's politically shaped things, geopolitically shaped things, is once we realized, okay, you can supplement your soil with these nutrients, these inorganic, we need nitrogen, we need phosphorus, where are we going to get it from? And then
I haven't gotten to the guano section yet, but I just have realized, looking at the index, that there's 2 pages devoted to Nauru, which is of course an entire striking thing, because that whole nation's economy, the centerpiece was that phosphate extraction by the British Phosphate Company. So, I mean, most of it was exhausted by 1990. And there is an endless number of scholarly papers and non-scholarly accounts of how colonization has sort of devastated that island in and of itself. With getting that resource.
And it's interesting.
And I think they're still trying to drill in some of the already exhausted areas. So it's just very frustrating to read.
Yeah.
And that was the first I had heard of that place. It was new to me. So that was another thing I learned from this book.
Yeah. Just very interesting. We're coming up on our hour. Any closing thoughts from anybody about this particular book?
It's not, it was just something that was on my mind yesterday because I had finished the section where he was talking about the slave trade, and his overall ideas were interesting. I did think some of the language he used, I thought if he had written it in 2022 or it was edited in 2022, it would have been written in a different way. That section, and maybe it's just my social justice hat, but I didn't love the way it was written.
I agree with you. I think it was, there were a few places where his kind of singular focus on soil scientists really kind of marginalized things that should have been more at the forefront in thinking about the impact of certain things.
So earlier in the book, he was talking about ancestral Puebloan people and making some type of correlation. And I've studied them a little bit, not a ton, but I felt like he was like talking a little reductively. I felt like he was making a conclusion that wasn't 100% true.
And I do think possibly part of the reason he was so exhaustive is because it's possible that if you pick a particular society or a time example and dig into it, you're going to find specialists who go, no, wait a minute. Like, yes, this was going on. However, there was still all this other stuff happening. So I wonder if part of his tendency towards being exhaustive is to try to really build support for his thesis so that it couldn't get like Jenga'd away by somebody going, yeah, but I know all about when the Romans were doing this and that, and here's why. So that's why that's
there was a lot of
example.
soil erosion may not have been the primary cause, but like that phrase does circulate throughout.
Yes, that phrase does a lot of heavy lifting and also overlooking big giant thing that you probably shouldn't overlook. And then he keeps going and I'm like, ooh, that's a lot of heavy lifting that overlooking is doing right there.
One, I read another book called Mosquito, which the thesis is a little bit the same about how mosquitoes have shaped the course of history, the rise and fall of civilizations, and specifically the rise and fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the slave trade. And so it was a little bit funny to see two books that were kind of doing the same thing, but with like really putting the emphasis on different aspects of these societies.
I'm
so fascinated by that element of storytelling. Like, we're kind of talking about how this is nonfiction, but there is an element of storytelling, of the picking and choosing of like what parts you focus in on. And I've read so many books that are like about a single food ingredient that shaped all of human history. It can be cod, it can be yeast, it can be sugar, it can be who knows what, it can be mosquitoes. So I'm kind of tired of those now. Like, let's stop saying that because we all know it's not true and just say like, hey, this is meaningful.
Yeah, it is a really weird tendency, isn't it? I wonder if it comes from publishing, the economics of publishing, to kind of try to make your thing kind of forefront your thing and say, this is it. This is the big explanatory.
That's very generous. I think it has more to do with ego than publishing.
I think
when you start studying something, you start thinking about it and you get excited about it, you see it everywhere. And that's the way you feel about it.
That's true.
I think this is one of those cases where distillation is sort of manufactured to get you to a purified target, but when we're all left wondering about the impurities that are actually integral to the true understanding of the thing. So.
I think the thing that I would say with this is that you certainly can't argue that there's not a soil crisis. whether or not all of these civilizations collapsed because of primarily the soil crisis, you could debate, but in the end, that's kind of not the point, right? The point is we're kind of going, we do have a challenge ahead of us about how we're going to feed all of these people since our population is continuing to increase.
Insects. It's
Oh
easy.
man, I've seen a couple things about that recently. I'm apparently gonna have to work really hard on getting over that.
They're delicious.
Whew.
Don't worry about it. It's good.
Whew. I'll try.
The area I'm currently local to right now, the Tri-Cities in Southern Ontario, there is actually an insect protein processing plant that's being
Do they make it?
established.
Do they do like Snowpiercer it? Do they make it like into bricks and things?
I don't know, but I'm sure there's going
I
to
don't
be
know if
like an
anybody
energy. I mean,
knows that
yeah,
reference.
I mean, I'm sure they're going to be at least doing the little energy bar bricks in a little roughly composite thing at some point. Yeah.
I'll prepare myself. I'm gonna have to start. I mean, what is that? What is it called? Is it like exposure therapy when you're trying to get over?
Put chocolate on it and we can eat it.
There you go. There you go.
I was just gonna mention chocolate because there's regulations or thresholds for how many insect parts can be in X amount of chocolate. So
Insect parts
you
per
eat
million.
insects all the time. You
I
just
know.
didn't know
That's what-
it's ground in with the.
That's what I was trying to tell myself. Your
Yeah.
insects parts per million is probably happening.
Yeah.
All right. So thanks everybody for a good discussion. I'm going to stop the recording here, but if people can hang on in the room for just a minute, I'll ask you about scheduling the next one. But thanks. This was really good discussion.